Today I want to talk about pulling permits. So pulling building permits for any renovations that you plan to do in your home. Hi, I'm Samantha Scribilo with the Queen team of Remax. And today we are going to talk about why it is so important to pull the proper required building permits if you're planning to do any renovations to your home. I will say there's a ton of information on this topic on the City of Winnipeg's website, specifically on the Planning and Property Development page. On this website, you're going to find lots of information in regards to what renovations or projects need a building permit and which do not. Blanket statement I've been told from the City of Winnipeg is if you're changing like for like, you don't necessarily need a permit. So for example, if you are renovating your bathroom and you're changing out everything to be the exact same placement, so we're not moving plumbing around, we're changing the existing vanity for a new vanity, typically you're not going to need a permit for that job. If you're changing a window to the same size window, you're not going to need a permit. However, if you are changing different aspects of the property, things like electrical, plumbing, window size, these projects will likely require a permit. So again, do a little bit of research on the City of Winnipeg's property planning and development website before starting any projects at home. Here in the City of Winnipeg, the permit search website is accessible to anyone of the public. So anyone, you don't have to be a realtor or a builder or anything like that to access this information on the City of Winnipeg's website. You can search any address in Winnipeg and you will come up with a permit search. So any permits that were pulled on that address will show up in this permit search or lack thereof. The system isn't perfect, as it will only search back to the year 2000. However, all of the permits that should have been pulled or would be pulled for a specific address will show up in this search. The reason I bring this up is because educated buyers are looking at this system. So especially as an agent, if I'm representing a buyer client, I pull a permit search on any home that I'm going to show. So that means that buyer is going to be made aware if, for example, there has been work done that permits were required and I don't see the permit history up on the permit search website. One misconception I really want to touch base on is oftentimes people think that if they are hiring a contractor, permits were pulled. That is not the case. I often see projects done where a contractor was brought in, all experienced tradesmen, all licensed tradesmen were doing the work. However, permits were not pulled. So it's important to, when you are hiring a contractor to do projects on your home, ask the questions, make sure they are pulling the permit. That might mean it's a little bit of an extra cost to you. However, it will be worth it in the long run. So just do your due diligence. Make sure that if a contractor is coming in to do a project and they tell you that permits are not needed, I would recommend doing a little bit of digging on the city's website just to be sure that that is the case. If there is any permits required to the project that you're wanting to take on, again, I would highly recommend that you pull those permits and make sure that everything is being done correctly, just so that it doesn't come to bite you later down the road if you were to sell your property. Next, I want to touch on why this is so important to be aware of, whether you're a buyer or a seller here in Winnipeg. Okay, so what are the risks of purchasing a property where potentially work has been done without the required permits? So a lot of people don't quite grasp this concept, but it is the responsibility of the current homeowner. So if you were to ever get caught, or if the city were to ever say, hey, this basement was done and we didn't know about it and it was done without permits, that then is the responsibility of the buyer, regardless of if you knew about the permits being pulled or not. Now you are the owner of the property. Hence why it's important to do your digging as a buyer to make sure that that's not the case. However, I will say some buyers don't care as much as others, and in some cases, the risk might be worth the reward. So I like to paint the picture. Let's say you're purchasing a property and a bathroom was added in the home and the required permits were not pulled. It's a beautiful spa-like bathroom. You know about this as a buyer before making an offer to purchase on the home. And you're saying, that's okay, I'm okay with that. Then somehow the city finds out that this bathroom was added, maybe through the MLS system. However, you're now being looked at for why is there a bathroom in your home and no permits were pulled. Couple things there that would happen. So first thing is a little fine for every permit that was supposed to be pulled in the project. So maybe that's electrical permit. So you get a fine for not pulling the electrical permit. You get a fine for not pulling the plumbing permit, and so on and so forth. The fine typically isn't that expensive, okay? You're kind of looking at that $150 to $250 potentially. Again, don't quote me, but ballpark numbers for these fines. That is not the expensive part of this risk. The expensive part of this risk is now being able to prove that this work was done to code. So what that might mean is ripping out drywall or ripping out the beautiful tile shower that you purchased to prove that that plumbing was done correctly. And now you're left with that cost. So important to know that going in. And another thing to note, it's your responsibility regardless if you completed that bathroom or if it was a previous owner. So another reason that it's so important that buyers are educated around this permit subject. So let's talk a little bit about this from the buyer's perspective. Everyone's comfort level is different, and everyone's comfort level is different maybe depending on permits that were supposed to be pulled. So my job as a realtor, educate my buyer on this is what I think should have been done with permits, and I don't see any permit history here. Maybe sometimes the risk is a little bit less, sometimes it's a little bit higher. So again, that example that I used previously about adding a bathroom, that could potentially be a very big cost in order to prove that bathroom was done to code. However, maybe the seller added a deck to the property. And worst case scenario, if that deck has to come off and be proved it was done to code, maybe you're willing to take on that risk, okay? In my experience, on the buyer side of things, some people don't want anything to do with a property that permits were not pulled. Others don't care at all, and they don't care what the permit was. However, I would say most people kind of fall in that middle ground. So again, if you're thinking about doing any major renovations to your home that would require permits, I would definitely recommend pulling them. Now again, looking at it from the seller's perspective. So let's say you spent a ton of money, redid your kitchen, and it is a chef's dream of a kitchen. Okay, you didn't pull the permits. For the reason that I just kind of talked about from the buyer's perspective, you are limiting your buyer pool. So it is important to understand if you want to take that risk and do your kitchen without permits, not all buyers will be okay taking on that risk. As a seller, of course, you don't want to limit your buyer pool. You want as many people to be as interested as possible in your home. So we want to make sure that we're not limiting our buyer pool and pulling those permits if required. Another question is, how would people know? How are buyers gonna know that I completed the kitchen without a permit? So a couple things. They're typically working with a realtor. Buyers are working with a realtor, and the realtor is pulling these searches and doing their due diligence for their buyer clients. So your buyers that are coming through the home are likely gonna know that. Also, there is a question on the property disclosure statement form that you will have to answer in regards to permits. The question on the PDS reads, Are you aware of any additions or alterations to the buildings or improvements on the property that were made while you owned the property and were made without the required building, electrical, or other permit, or without obtaining a final inspection from the regulatory authority? So as a seller, let's say you spent the money to put in that chef's kitchen. Now you have to answer yes to that question on the PDS and provide a little bit of an explanation as to your answer to that question. So you will have to say something along the lines of, we completed our kitchen in X year and we did not pull electrical or plumbing permits. So going back to eliminating your buyer pool, you don't want to eliminate your buyer pool. Trust me, it is always worth it to pull the permit. The permit itself is not that expensive. Sometimes, yes, it might be a little bit more of a headache to deal with the city. Maybe a little bit more time is added to the project, but again, it will be worth it in the long run. So once again, I think it truly pays off in all situations to pull the required permits if you're going to plan to do any home renovations on your property. This includes adding sheds, building decks, plumbing permits, moving any plumbing around, electrical. This is not an exhaustive list, so again, I would encourage you to check out the City of Winnipeg's website. However, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out. Once again, I'm Samantha Scribilo with the Queen team of RE/MAX. Thanks for watching this video today.